We're continuing with our sermon series called A Firm Foundation, and we've been talking about how our covenant relationship with God is a firm foundation for our life. And today we're talking about how it is a firm foundation for our hope. We have a hope for the future because of our covenant with God through Jesus Christ. And so if you'll go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 21, if you have a device or a Bible in front of you, you can turn with us. If not, you could just listen, that's fine. We're going to start in verse 7. We're talking here about the triumphal entry. As Jesus approached the last week of his life, as he approached his crucifixion on the cross, he entered into Jerusalem and received a very triumphal response from the people. And in verse 7 of Matthew 21, it says, "They brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks, and he sat on them. Most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And the crowds that went before him and that followed him were shouting, 'Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest.' And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, 'Who is this?' And the crowd said, 'This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee.'" Well, it's an interesting picture that we get here, and we can imagine just crowds of people and these great shouts and this welcoming of David to the Son of David, they said. And when they say the Son of David, it's interesting because they use that phrase differently than we do. The son of somebody is the continuation of them. And so what they're saying is this is the continuation of David the king. And so they're just overjoyed with the fact that he has arrived there. And what we want to do is look at this hopeful, this joyful situation and break it down a little bit. We want to look at, first of all, the foundation for hope. Then we want to see what the price of hope is. And then we want to look at, finally, the future of hope. And so as we get into this text, there's a few things that might be surprising to us or unusual to us as modern people. And the first one here is that they have this donkey, and they put their cloaks on the donkey, and then as Jesus enters into the city, these people are putting their cloaks on the ground. And that's a strange thing for us. We don't really quite know what to make of it, because it's not like, if the president were driving down the street, we would just, take off our cloaks or our coats and put them down so that his motorcade could drive over them. That's not something that we do. And so it's hard for us to understand exactly what's happening here. But there's a really important symbolic thing that is going on, and this idea is that back in the ancient world, there were two things about clothing that were really important. Number one, clothing was very expensive. Most people had one set of clothing, and it was very costly. In fact, it was kind of a store of wealth back then. If you had multiple sets of clothes, it wasn't like you just, you wore one on Monday and one on Tuesday and so forth. You probably had those multiple sets of clothes as a store of value. Basically, you could have gold or silver, you could have clothing, and you could have food. That's the way that you stored your wealth back in that time period. And so when you laid down your article of clothing, that represented a costly sacrifice. Because it wasn't like it wasn't going to get dirty. It wasn't like it couldn't be damaged by this. This is something that's incredibly costly. It's a huge sacrifice. But it represented an even bigger sacrifice. And that was the second thing that was important about clothing in the Old Testament times, is that clothing represented your identity. So we kind of see this now, right? Because if you see a policeman, if I say picture in your mind a policeman, what do you picture? You picture somebody in uniform, right? When you go to court, you would probably be shocked if, the judge was sitting there in a Hawaiian shirt, right, and some flip-flops. You would probably wonder, do I want to be judged by this court? It would surprise you. You would say, what's happening here? Right, we expect the judge to do what? He needs to have a black robe on. So the judge needs to be dressed appropriately because that's his identity. And if he wasn't wearing that, we would wonder what's happening. In the same way back in the ancient world, the idea of clothing, it was your identity. And what's happening here is a really important picture, is that these people are laying down the symbols of themselves. Because in the ancient world, the idea was that the king was enthroned upon his people. In fact, the throne was just a symbol of the people itself. The throne, the chair wasn't important. What was important was the idea that he's the king because he's enthroned on his people. You know, here's the thing. If you think you're the king and nobody will do what you want them to do, you're not really the king. Right? You're enthroned upon the people, and you're enthroned upon the obedience of the people. And so when Jesus is entering into Jerusalem and these people are laying down their clothes, and he's writing about what they're symbolically doing is they're laying down their lives and saying that our obedience, our personhood, ourselves, we are at your disposal. You are enthroned upon us. It's interesting that Jesus rides in on a donkey because the Israelite kings were to ride donkeys and not horses. They often skirted this by riding mules. It was like a halfway. We're kind of doing what we should be doing. But the point was that the donkey, it was a representation of gentleness and humility. Jesus wasn't coming to conquer forcefully. He wasn't coming to force them to lay down their wills to him. And there's another side of this too that was humility, because the idea was that the donkey represented the people and their will, because that's what the person is enthroned on. And you can see that by the fact that the people lay their cloaks over the donkey. The donkey is representative of them as a people, and he is enthroned upon them. Now think about it for a second, and you might get to the point where you start to see the joke. It's kind of an insult. If Jesus is riding on a strong horse, it shows horses were used for war. It shows this desire or possibility of him taking things by force, but it also shows that he's enthroned upon a people of greatness. But instead, Jesus is enthroned upon a donkey. He's coming humbly. And part of that humility is his willingness to be king of a humble people. It's not to say that it will always be like this, though. If you turn to Revelation chapter 19, verse 11, it says, "Then I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war." And what you see there is this picture of Jesus riding on this white horse and this great mass of people following him. And it's a picture of the church, because the army that's following him is the church, but the white horse is also the church. And the idea is that this humble people has become something pure, holy, and strong, something glorious. And that's important. We see in laying the clothing down that these people make a great sacrifice, and you might ask why? Why go through all of this? Why give up yourself or some of yourself? Why do this? Because that's the question that the world asks. And you might not understand it, but they do. They ask this question all the time. In fact, the world watches you. The world looks at you, and the world watches you, and the world wonders, why are you making the sacrifice that you're making? Because if you are a Christian, what it means is that you've laid down your life to Christ, that He is your King, that your will and your life have been laid down before Him. In this picture of the triumphal entry, you have a picture of us, you have a picture of the church, you have a picture of people who have invited Jesus to be their King. And the world looks at you and the world asks, why have you done this? Why go through the expense of sacrifice? And the answer is important for us to know and understand and to live out and to manifest in our lives. And the reason is because without sacrifice, there can be no covenant. Remember what a covenant is. A covenant is where two things become one thing. That's so important for us to understand. Two things become one thing. Now, it's important to know that there is more than one way to make two things into one thing. If you want to make two things into one thing, you can go about it a couple of different ways. One thing can absorb the other thing, in which case that thing that God absorbed ceases to exist. It's no longer what it was. And usually when that happens, the thing that stops existing didn't want to stop existing. And so there's an element of tyranny. There's an element of destruction. There's an element of slavery that comes from that. You see, the idea of sacrifice is the idea of us giving something up willingly, not something being taken from us. Christ did not come on a war horse to subjugate us. Christ came on a donkey. And we can offer our lives. We can make a sacrifice. We can offer it up. And then the world wonders, well, why would you do that? And the answer, of course, we've given is because without that, there is no covenant. Well, so what, some might say? Why do we need covenant? Because without covenant, there is only domination. The world has a theory, and that theory is known as Marxism. Maybe you've heard of this. It made some news some time ago. So in Marxism, the theory is that you have the haves and the have-nots. And there's an eternal war, struggle for domination. And in fact, that's the theory of the world and the theory of world history that most people believe, whether they understand it or not. They believe that everything is a struggle. Somebody's trying to destroy you. Somebody's trying to consume you. Somebody's trying to dominate you. Somebody's trying to enslave you. And so you have to protect yourself from that. You do not sacrifice yourself. You defend yourself because there is only war. There is only struggle. There is only the thirst for control and domination. Well, maybe that's true. Maybe that's the way that life is. In fact, a lot of people live their lives as if that's true. There's another theory, though, and that other theory is that our covenant relationship with the God is the foundation of our hope. There's another theory, and the theory is that God, in the very pattern of existence, has laid out a different way. And that different way is something that is entirely unexpected. Even though it can be seen everywhere, it's entirely unexpected. And that is the pattern of sacrifice. That rather than going to war and trying to dominate each other, we can have a covenant with each other in which each of us sacrifices ourselves for the other. That a unity can be created outside of domination, and that unity that can be created comes from love for one another. In fact, I would say that it's the very pattern of our earthly corporal existence. That in every aspect of creation you see a microcosm of this being played out, this idea of God's that we can sacrifice ourselves for one another, that a covenant can be made, and that covenant relies on sacrifice. You can see it as a farmer takes some of the seed that he was able to collect from the year previously, and instead of eating it or feeding it to his family, he goes out into the world and he casts that seed to the ground. It looks for all the world like he's simply throwing it away. He's taking food, which is life for himself and his family, and he's just throwing it out before God onto the ground. And why does he do this? He makes this sacrifice because this is the nature of creation that God has made. And that in this sacrifice, God takes this sacrifice and God multiplies it 100-fold. And so that there is more than there was before. You see this when Jesus takes a small child's lunch. He takes a few loaves of bread and a few fish, and he gives thanks, lifts them up before God and gives thanks. And he feeds 5,000 people, and there are 12 baskets left over. In fact, in every aspect of your life, what you find is that there is another way, and that other way is the way of covenant. That you can make sacrifices in your life, and those sacrifices unify you with something else. And that when you make a sacrifice and you unify with something else, that thing produces fruit. You see it all the time. I remember being a kid, and I remember watching the space shuttle. I was too young to remember watching the Apollo moonshots that went up, but I would imagine that they were stunning to witness. The idea is fascinating to me because when I watched the shuttle, I got something similar to that. I don't know if you guys remember that, but I remember as a kid, we watched it in school. The space shuttle would be launched, and we would watch it in school. And did any of you think, as I did, wow, I did this. Look at what I've done. Anyone else? Nobody? I guess we've revealed something about myself. I said, wow, look at what I've done. Well, it wasn't quite that crass. I said, wow, look at what we've done. Did anybody think that? I remember being proud. And I can imagine that if I was an American kid and I was watching the first moon landing, I would have been thinking to myself, look at what we've done. Now, as a kid, my contribution to this whole project, let's say, was small. If we're being honest, let's say that it was small. But even though my sacrifice was small to this project, in fact, almost non-existent, about the only thing you could say I sacrificed was I went to school and watched, as I was told, watched the thing go on. It was still a sacrifice that was being made. And even though it was small, I was small. But what I was part of was something bigger, something called America. And the thing is that that's what happens when we sacrifice. You see, we sacrifice ourselves for an extension of our lives into time and space. I was part of something called America, and as a group, what we Americans did was we went to the moon. We launched a space shuttle. I can also make other sacrifices. I can sacrifice and be part of a family. And as a family, we had a house, we had a place to live, and we had stuff that I could not get as a child. But as a child, what I was supposed to do was sacrifice some things to my parents. And those things were, I took out the trash, I was obedient, I went to school, I brushed my teeth, right? I made those sacrifices, and because of that, I got to be part of something bigger called a family. And our family got to be something bigger called a state. And our state got to be something bigger called a country, and we did amazing things. This is the pattern of sacrifice, and it's the pattern of sacrifice everywhere, and this is the foundation of hope. We make sacrifices in hope. The farmer plants his seed in hope. The fisherman throws out his net in hope. All of us make sacrifices in hope. Why do we do this? Because it's the nature of creation that God has made. These sacrifices work because this is how God has made creation to work. That when we willingly give some of ourselves to something bigger than ourselves, then we grow. There's a blessing. And we know this because we engage in it all the time. The world is not just a war of domination. The world is not just a war of domination. There is much more to life and existence than this. Because the world was made by a God of love who says, when you give yourself in love to something else, something new, a covenant is created, and that gives life, and that gives blessing, and that gives glory. And so the people who laid down their cloaks for Jesus, they were no fools. They were not fools. And we are not fools either. Well, there's a price of hope, and we need to understand that price. Because if we fail to pay the price of hope, then we end up being hopeless. We were talking in our Sunday school class this morning about that. If you remember back when I was a kid, I remember when I was a kid. If you remember when you were a kid, there was probably this big scare about the population bomb that we were all going to die. Do you guys remember that? The world was going to be like, there were going to be people like bursting at the seams of every place you went to. Like you'd go into McDonald's and you just wouldn't fit because there's so many people coming out. And there was people everywhere and everybody was going to die. Do you guys remember that? And now what they're telling us is something completely different. I don't know if you've heard this, but they're warning of population collapse. They're warning of population collapse. And one of the things that's interesting is I've noticed that in the modern world, that relationships can be very difficult. In fact, I know some people who are younger. I'm at the point in my life, it seems strange to talk about young people, because it infers that I am not. And I know I'm not, but it doesn't feel like that should be the case. Young people I've talked to talk about the fact that it's hard to have relationships now. That you can make plans with people and they don't show up and they don't text and this is just the world. And all the young people that I talk to talk about this, that this is the world now. And it's not that these people don't want to have friends, they do, but the problem is that they were feeling a certain way when they made the plan. But then when it came time to manifest that plan, to put it into action, to live it out, they feel a different way. And so they go with how they felt. When they felt like making a plan, they made a plan, and now when they feel like not following through with it, they just don't. This apparently is the state of the world now. I'm not saying every single person is like this, but apparently this is something that's fairly common. You see, we have a desire for friends. We have a desire for covenant. We have a desire to make our lives bigger, but we also at the same time have a desire to avoid sacrifice. We have a desire to make ourselves safe. You know, and the interesting thing is when you come down to it, I was listening to a guy lecturing, and he was talking about how human beings kind of have two motives for everything that they do. And the two motives seem to be to gain life or to protect it. I want to gain life for myself, or I want to protect the life that I have. I want to gain respect, and I want to keep the respect that I have. I want to guard that. I want to gain a reputation of being a good guy, and I want to protect the relation or the reputation that I have. I want to gain love, and I want to protect the love that I have. I want to gain money, and I want to protect the money that I have. All through life, this is the way that it works. And we're acting out of one of these two scenarios. The problem is that often these scenarios are at cross purposes with themselves. The reality is that without the hope that drives sacrifice, I cannot hope to gain anything. I cannot hope to gain. I cannot hope to increase my life. I cannot hope to increase my relationships, increase the closeness that I feel, increase the size of my life as I gain those relationships without sacrificing And the funny thing here is that I have to give up some of myself in order to gain more of myself. And in fact, in order to gain anything, I have to make sacrifice. And I have to show myself as somebody who's willing to make sacrifices. In ancient times, it was not unusual for people to sacrifice all kinds of things to their local gods. And a lot of times these local gods were various idols that they worshipped, and they could sacrifice all kinds of things, from some of their crops to any number of things, including sometimes in some idolatry, they sacrificed their children. And a modern person looks at this and says, why? Why would somebody do such a thing? I mean, understanding that with children is just off the table, but even bringing some of your crops and sacrificing it to God, setting it on fire in front of some statue, why would you do this? And the answer is because they wanted to gain a bigger life. And you should say to yourself, well, how does that make your life bigger? Well, it's not hard to see, really, if you think about it. Think about living in a bad neighborhood. Say Mogadishu. You live in Mogadishu, and it's a dangerous place there. And here's the thing. You've got some valuable stuff at home. You've got your family. You've got valuable things in your home. You have to go off to work, and you wonder to yourself, can I trust the people around me that they're not going to steal all my stuff? How can I go off to work? Now, put yourself in the same position in an ancient world. Like you live in the Canaanite lands during the Old Testament times. And you need to go off and you need to go work in the field, or you need to go conduct a transaction in another town. And so you've got to leave your family, you've got to leave your wife and your young children and all of the things that you hold dear. You've got to leave them at home and you've got to go and travel. How in the world do you know that you can trust? It's not like they have, Ring doorbells were not made during this time. How do you know that you can leave all your valuable? How do you know that the people around you can be trusted not to kill your family and steal your children and burn down your house when you're gone? How do you know that they can be trusted? Well, they sacrifice to something called an idol, and by being willing to put something of value to this thing that ends up binding you all together, they show that not only do they value the things that you value, but they value them enough to be trusted. Because here's the point. It's not just the values you have. It's how much do you value the values you have. You see, a lot of people can be fine in one moment, but not fine in the next. And the reality is this, that there is a price to be paid if we want to trust each other, if we want to be able to operate together, if we want to be able to expand our lives, to be able to go hither and yon and do all kinds of business and expand our lives and go out and work in the field and raise a crop and leave my kids at home and do all that kind of stuff. There's certain values that we need to have, but not only do we need to have them, but they have to have a certain value to us. And how do you know? Israel had a system of sacrifice like all the other cultures of their time. And what Israel learned was that no one values their values adequately. Israel found out, like every other culture, that sin was waiting right at the door. That the problem with us covenanting with one another is we cannot be trusted. All of us will break it. All of us cannot be counted upon. That the sin is right there at the door, and sin will destroy our families and destroy our nations. Sin will destroy all of our covenants. Sin will destroy our friendships. Sin will destroy everything that you value. All sin, we sacrifice one moment and we break our values the next. So how do you know who to covenant with? What is worthy of putting all your trust in? What is worthy of giving all of your life to? In Mark chapter 12, verse 41 through 44, Jesus tells this interesting story. In Mark 12, 41 through 44, it says that he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. So Jesus is here, and he's watching this thing unfold. He's watching this scene. You know, and it would be an interesting thing because back in this day and age, it wasn't unusual to make a big deal of the fact that you're giving an offering. Right? Because you wanted everybody to see that. I'm a trustworthy guy. I'm a good guy. I'm in. I'm all in. We're all together. I'm all in. Look at how much I'm all in. They would make a big deal out of this. And in verse 42, it says, a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to him and said to them, truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box, for they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. Jesus here is pointing out the fact that this woman has put in everything. What could be worthy of such a sacrifice? If none of us can be trusted, if all of us fail, if all of our nations are full of sin, if everything is not worth ourselves, are the skeptics right? Are our sacrifices in vain? Well, the answer, because of Jesus, is no, they're not in vain. Let's talk about the future of hope. The future of hope is so important for us to understand because what Jesus is getting at through his entire life and ministry is that there is one thing that is worth everything that you have. Sacrifice, according to Jesus, is not a waste, but an investment. We have a hope for our future, an eternal future. Here's the thing that's interesting, is you make a small sacrifice and you get a small reward. Imagine that you're a farmer and you say, I'm going to take 10% of my seed, I'm going to hold it back and I'm going to plant it next year. We're going to cut back. We're going to watch our weights. We're going to trim calories. We're going to go on a diet. We're going to go keto. Whatever it is that you have to do, you're going to hold back 10% of your seed, and you're going to put that out next year, and you get this reward because you get 100 times as much as you put out. Well, think about this. What if you could sacrifice 20% of your seed? Well, then you would get a bigger return, right? What if you could sacrifice 50% of your seed? What if you could sacrifice everything? We have hope for the future because there is something that is worthy of sacrificing everything. In covenants, we enlarge our life through time and space. We make sacrifices, and that makes our lives bigger. But what if you could sacrifice everything and get back a proper return? What if you could lay down your whole life like they symbolized in triumphal entry? What if you could do it all? You see, here's the reality of the situation. Every ideal, every God that you can possibly worship will require a sacrifice. Every God or any ideal that you hold up in your life as being worth something will require a sacrifice. But the problem is this: no other God has ever died for you. Do you understand how important this is? Nothing else that you could possibly sacrifice to has sacrificed everything for you. You see, if you want to avoid being tyrannized, if you want to avoid something dominating you, then you have to sacrifice to something that's going to sacrifice in return. If you sacrifice to something that doesn't sacrifice in return, you've lost yourself. You've become a thing to that thing that you represent or that you worship. You become nothing but a tool. You've been subsumed into it. If you give all of yourself and all of your identity to something that's not giving all of itself back to you, then you have been a fool and you have lost. But there is only one God that you could worship that has died for you. There is only one God who has given all of himself in exchange for all of yourself. There is only one exchange that you can make. There is only one sacrifice in this world where you can give everything and still win. Because no matter how big you are, you're not bigger than God. And when he gives all of himself and you give all of yourself, you win. You come out ahead. We were reading in our Sunday school class today about the early Christians and how they gave up their life. And many people would say that they were fools because the early Christians, they died in some horrible ways. Sometimes they were just executed, but sometimes they were put out into the Colosseum where they were eaten by wild animals or tortured in horrible ways. But they were not fools. Because in giving everything, they got eternity. They got a life that was infinite in time and space. In John chapter 12, verses 24 through 26, Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Whoever loves his life loses it, and whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, he must follow me, and where I am, there will my servant be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him." Unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it can't bear any fruit. Your life sacrificed for Christ, given up, a living sacrifice of obedience to him, is not a sacrifice that is made in vain. Making him your king, putting down your life and enthroning him is not foolish, but is the wisest investment that you could possibly make. We make the sacrifice of having the covenant of God be the foundation of our life because of our hope in the future, because of our knowledge that this is the way that God has created the world to work, that when we lay down our life for him, we get him in return. So how do we apply this? Well, first of all, you have to believe in God's glory. God has unlimited value. There is nothing that you can give that is of greater worth than what you get. Secondly, we need to belong to him through the covenant. There's only one way to make this value real in your life, and that is to give yourself to him in obedience. And finally, we need to become glorious by being transformed to his goal of glory. We invite you to work through our conversations with God this week and our conversations about God. This week is really about how do you make this real in your life. It's not about studying and doing that kind of, it's about going out and being obedient. So we invite you to do that. This has been a great week of worship and celebration for us. It's great to have Jack here and leading us in worship. We have a great time ahead of us next door with food and all kinds of fun and fellowship. But don't let this end here today. Spend some time this week making this real for you.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to this church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.